Hello everyone, welcome to the Hardwood Biofuels webinar series. This is the sixth in our series of webinars we have been offering starting last fall. All of these webinars are archived on our website, hardwoodbiofuels.org. So if you have friends or colleagues that would be interested in these or our other webinars, they are available there. If you are just joining us, could you please answer our poll questions to give us some background on who is joining us today and your experience with modeling the growth and yield of poplars in the Pacific Northwest? As usual, it looks like most of today's audience comes from an academic background, and we have a few of our AHB research partners joining us. There are instructions on your screen for connecting your audio. If you have any difficulty hearing us, chat box is a way to communicate with me, Patricia Townsend from Washington State University, and then my co-host for today's webinar, Nora Hayter, also from Washington State University. I'll give you another minute or two to answer the poll questions. If you can, please answer poll 1 and 2, and then I'll do a short introduction on the Advanced Hardwood Biofuels Northwest project, and then introduce our speakers today from University of California, Davis. So thanks to all of you for entering our poll questions. So Advanced Hardwood Biofuels Northwest. Our project is to take purpose-grown hybrid poplar trees, grow them on short rotations and harvest them every 2 to 3 years, and then turn them into biochemicals and drop-in replacement transportation fuels. These are fuels that can be used as direct replacements for existing fossil fuels in cars, trucks, and aircraft. We have many research project partners, including University of California, Davis. The main institution for the project is University of Washington, and the project is divided up into 5 different teams that work on different aspects of the project to look at the whole range of ways that you would need to produce these drop-in fuels. So we have a feedstock team that works on growing the poplars. We have a conversion team that works on taking the poplars and the technology for economically turning them into fuels. We have a sustainability team that works on all aspects of the economic, environmental, and social sustainability. We have an education team that is working on a new workforce for this new industry. And then we have the extension team that works on communication and outreach. So today, our webinar is modeling short rotation hybrid poplar plant growth and yield in the Pacific Northwest. We have 3 researchers from our sustainability team at the University of California, Davis. Does it change now? Okay, so we have Dr. Quinn Hart, we have Dr. Nathan Parker, and Dr. Prasad Bandura, who will be speaking to us and giving us an overview of the work they have been doing on modeling poplar growth and yield. Just as an announcement, about midway through the webinar, Quinn is going to demonstrating an online tool, Poplar Growth Model. And so you can go to this link and follow along as he is demonstrating how to use this online tool. So now I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleagues at University of California, Davis.
Okay. We are ready to go. Um, Good morning, all of you. Welcome to the today's webinar, modeling short rotation hybrid poplar plant growth and yield in the Pacific Northwest region. My name is Prasad Bandaru. I am here with my colleagues Quinn Hurt and Nathan Parker. We are all researchers at the University of California, Davis, and working together as a part of the sustainability team of the HP project led by Professors Rick Gustafson from University of Washington and Professor Brian Jenkins from UC Davis. Here is the overview of our webinar. Uh, Before going to overview, I would like to mention the main objective of today's webinar is to demonstrate the features and application of a plant growth model that we have been using to estimate the potential biomass of the hybrid poplar growing as a short rotation crop. Um, the overview of this presentation, here is the overview of our presentation. First, I will start with providing a general background about the research goals of the sustainability team and also the role of poplar growth model in the sustainability research. Then Quinn Hart will take over and spend most of the presentation talking about 3PG growth model and the modifications that we made to the original 3PG growth model in order to estimate the poplar biomass of the hybrid poplar when grown as a short rotation crop. In addition to that, he also demonstrate online version of the model with which any user can predict the biomass yields by selecting the location of their interest and specific management practices that they are interested in. Just to note that the demonstration is with using the static screenshots of the different steps for using the model. After that, Nathan Parker will talk about how we use the 3PG growth model and biomass estimates in our sustainability research. So this is and with that we will conclude the presentation. Um, okay, let's move on to the actual presentation. The the main goal of sustainability research is to make sure uh, the biofuel industry of the biofuel industry in the Pacific Northwest region based on the hybrid poplar is environmentally, economically, and socially sustainable. With that goal, we have developed a framework, a framework with a series of models to with a series of models uh, to provide a different decisions, to provide different solutions related to the economic, environmental, and social sustainability. Nathan Parker will talk about some of the results coming from this modeling framework, but here the main point is the 3PG poplar growth model is a very key element in our total modeling framework because we require the potential biomass estimates for this region based on the hybrid poplar production to use in the different models. So with this brief information, I will turning over to the Quinn Hurt who will talk about poplar plant growth model. Thank you.
Thanks, Prasad. I'm going to jump right in. As Prasad said, the very first part of being able to do the economic sustainability is to understand the type of yields that you're going to get from short rotation woody crops. And the way that we do this is that we use the 3PG model in order to do the modeling for the poplar growth. And 3PG model is a model that was developed in the late 90s originally by J.J. Landsberg and has been developed continuously from that point. In general, the 3 Ps stand for physiological processes for predicting growth. And in general, it's a relatively simple model. What the model does is actually try to formulate a description of how a real tree or plantation will grow under certain weather conditions. And then at a monthly time step, it actually runs that model and then accumulates all of that growth throughout the life of the tree. So as an input, you have the sun, which is providing a certain amount of energy to the plants. And then within that, there's a certain number of limiters on how much of that energy can actually be used to produce growth for the plant. And these limiters might be related to the weather. They might be limiters based on the temperature or the vapor pressure difference or how much frost, or on different aspects of the water availability, or aspects of the tree itself, the age of the tree, not only its overall age, but the age of the individual coppice. And the response to those trees to those input conditions is also part of the factors that are modeled. So at every time step, you get a certain amount of potential energy that's moderated by these limiters to create a certain amount of growth. And then that growth is partitioned into 3 different sections of the tree: the foliar, biomass, stem, and roots, and it's cumulatively added together. Now, in addition to the tree and the soil and the weather, we also have a number of parameters that describe the particular plantation, with things like the spacing or the type of seedling that was originally planted, and management practices that include things like how often you coppice, what the interval is, whether or not you irrigate, things like that. So those 5 different input parameter classes go into this model and creates this monthly time step. And besides just the carrying over a cumulative amount of the growth, we actually carry a whole host of other parameters that are describing the actual state of the plantation at any particular moment in time. While this seems like a relatively simple model, in practice it becomes a little bit more complicated. In order to actually describe all of the individual functions that are moderating the growth, there are about 35 different parameters that relate to the individual tree that have to be identified. And then there's a handful of parameters that have to do with the plantation, the management, the weather, and the soil, and the other inputs. And at the same time, what we're actually tracking is about 30 different separate state variables at any one of those monthly time increments. So besides the growth of the model, you have variables that include the amount of water maybe that's available at a particular time, or what those individual limiting factors are at any monthly time step. On the left-hand side here, we see a relatively simple example. In this case, we're showing a graph that shows the limiter due to temperature. And this is a functional relationship on temperature that needs as input 3 different parameters for the tree: the minimum, the maximum, and an optimal operating temperature in order to develop that particular curve. So when you pull apart the model and look at all of the individual features, there's a larger number of physical and parameters that are being modeled, and the state of which are being maintained on this monthly time step. And a lot of those actually feed back so that you use the previous month's values to do your predictions for the month going forward. The original model as developed for the 3PG could not account very well for coppicing. And the primary reason for that was that without any foliage in the original 3PG model, there would be no growth at all. All of the growth came from photosynthetic growth. But with coppicing, you have a different scenario. After you have coppiced, you have no foliage on top, but you actually have this excess of root mass below. So what we've done to support the regrowth of a coppiced poplar tree is that we've developed a model that will supply a small contribution from the root on a monthly time step. And that contribution goes in as directly as an additive to the normal productivity that the plant would have been providing, or maybe at the very early growth through its photosynthetic rate as well. And they go into the same pool and get divided in the same manner as the original 3PG model. What we've done is we've made the contribution targeted to what the potential growth of a plant would be based on the current weather conditions. And so what that means is that if you coppice in the late fall, then you have this ability to contribute to growth from the root. But since the weather conditions aren't amenable to that, that is, the plant wouldn't be growing at that time of the year anyways, that contribution won't actually occur until spring when weather conditions are more amenable to growth, and then the contributions will start to kick in at that point. Whereas if you were to coppice in the middle of the summer, that regrowth might occur immediately. We use a number of those individual state variables when we're doing our estimates for our economic yield predictions. But for the online model that we'll be demonstrating today, we also make those inputs and the outputs available to the researchers as well. So when you run the poplar growth model through the online application, we've tried to make it as easy as possible to give you as much information as we can about the individual growth of the scenario that you have chosen. Okay, so now I'm going to jump right in and give a demonstration of the online version of the poplar growth model. These are those URLs. I've also put it on the left-hand side so you can click directly on it if you're in your webinar web meeting to go to this. And feel free to try to follow along or investigate it as I'm giving this part of the presentation. So when you first log into the online application, you will see 4 major components of the application. Let me see if I can get this arrow to work. You'll see on the left-hand side here an area for inputs. On the right-hand side, you'll see an area for output charts. There's an area at the bottom for tabular output to be shown and manipulated. And then at the top, we have an area, a little toolbar that gives access to some of the more advanced capabilities. The inputs themselves, if you click on that area, you can see that it's divided into the same major components that we talked about earlier when describing the poplar growth model. There's a section of inputs having to do with the tree, an area with the plantation, the soil, the weather parameters, and the management. When you go to an individual tree, the tree input parameters, as I said previously, there's about 35 individual parameters that can be manipulated through this tool. And since that can be fairly daunting, we've tried to divide it into some major categories. And so each one of those major categories has a description about what those particular parameters affect. And then you can open those individual categories to look at the actual individual parameters within there. When you first look at the model, you don't have any results. The main reason for that is because there is no weather in the model a no default weather. We put a default poplar tree in to start one off, but we don't have a default weather. But right next to the inputs button is a little bit, another little box called location. So for the Pacific Northwest, we have another tool that allows users to get the average input weather data for any area in the Pacific Northwest, which will fill up the weather section. So when you click on that particular button on the left-hand side, your first view of this will be a large overview of the Pacific Northwest, and it will look like a bunch of blue dots that are not entirely filled in. That's sort of a function of the visualizer that we're using. But as you zoom in, you'll see what you're actually looking at is an 8 by 8 kilometer grid. And for each one of those individual grid points, if you click it, you can actually fill up the model with both the input soil parameters for that particular location and then also an average from the last 40 years of weather predictions for that area as well. If you use this Locate Me button that you see as well, it will do its best to locate where you're actually running the model and try to zoom you into that particular location. Once you've selected a particular location in your weather from your weather model, and you will be return back to the 3PG application, you'll see that the weather component is filled in. You get the average values as a table on the top, and then you also get a little figure that shows those values as they vary throughout the year. And you'll now have enough information for the model to be able to actually do a run. And so the model will automatically do a model run, and you'll get some predictions here on the right-hand side in the charts so that you can start to visualize the outputs. By default, we put in 3 different charts having to do with the total amount of biomass in the foliage and the roots and in the stems. And you can follow along here and see that we have 3 coppicing events that are modeled in this. And every time you see these large changes in the amount of stem and foliar biomass, that's when a coppicing event takes place. So as I said before, we want to give the users as much access to the individual plantation state as we can. So if you click on that Add button in the chart section, you'll actually get a list of those 30 or so different state parameters. And if you click on any of these particular boxes, then that chart will show up in your application as well. We try to do a job of giving a brief description about what those individual state parameters do. And if you want to see a little bit more information, we actually even include some of the functional relationships that are used in the calculation of those individual parameters. There are 2 types of charts in the application. By default, we use the basic chart, but if you click on the interactive section, you're given a more featureful chart to use. This allows you to select a particular range that you're interested in when you're viewing those charts, and then to use the slider to move up and back and forth throughout that. So this can be especially helpful if you're looking at a very large time frame and trying to look at details in the chart. As I said, you can, once you have the model running, you can actually modify any of these input parameters. For example, under the management framework, you might want to change the original date or particular month that you want to do the planting. You might want to change the date of the first coppice or change the interval. You might want to compare a 3-year cycle to a 4-year cycle of coppicing interval. And you can if you want to see more than a few harvests, you can pull out the date of the final harvest to a larger date. Another thing that you can do in the management practices is modify the amount of irrigation that you're going to use. This is something that we find that parameter that we're constantly adjusting to compare irrigated and non-irrigated yields for our economic models. And that's performed by this parameter irrigation fraction, where a 0 means that you're adding no additional water, and a 1 means that you're adding all the water that the model thinks that it will need to achieve maximum growth. And any fraction between those you can actually add in as well. So when you're actually comparing the model for these different inputs, for example, for this irrigation fraction, it's very important that you have the ability to compare what the outputs will be. So there's an additional feature for the application that instead of just putting in a single parameter, you can actually put in a comma delimited set of parameters. And when here, for example, we put in 0, 0.5, 1. And when you put in these comma separated versions of for the parameters, the model will actually go through and run a different run for each one of those versions of the model, and then plot all of those on the same chart. So from this particular location, you can see what your input parameters were, and then see how those affect the various outputs for your model. That is not only in the management area, it's in all of the inputs that you have access to. So, for example, if you went to the tree and wanted to see the change of model predictions based on here we're modifying the extinction coefficient, one of the inputs that affect the amount of energy that's gathered by the canopy, and you can make a modification of those as well. We actually give you the ability to add a comma-separated list to any 2 variables at the same time. So what it does is if it has 2 variables that are separated, it will actually run all of the combinations or the permutations of that model. So if, for example, you had 3 different versions of a particular factor in the tree, and you had 2 different irrigation fractions that you were interested in, the model would run 6 times and show you those outputs so that you could see sort of an envelope of predictions for that area. Okay, I'm going to go into some of the features in terms of how you store and save the model. What we've done is we've attached this model to Google accounts so that you are able to store and load your models from a Google Drive and access it that way. We've done this, first of all, so that you can, it's a good simple interface to store those individual models, and then they'll be available for wherever you're located, since they're stored in the cloud. In the right-hand side of the model, you'll actually see one of 2 things. If you are not logged into a Google account, you'll see a login button, and you'll have the ability to log in to Google. If you actually are logged into Google, you'll probably see your picture there to identify that you have already been logged in. And then you'll have a number of features that you can actually use to load and save individual models. Now, the very first time that you use the model, you'll actually be prompted to allow this model to access your Google Drive, because that's where we're storing and loading your data from. But after you've approved that one time, then you'll have access to these individual features. So once you've gone through that step, then you're able to load and save any models, and these will be stored onto your Google Drive. This shows a few of the input panels that you'll see in the process of loading or saving models. This first one here shows when you're trying to save a model. You have the ability to add a name and a small description so that you can recover those when you're loading them later. If you're actually modifying an existing model, you have the ability to update that as opposed to creating a new one. These are all combined together for when you go through and later try to load a particular model, where you'll actually get all of the files that have been created in a list that show both the title and then the small description of those. As with any Google file in Google Drive, you also have the ability to share these individual models with your collaborators. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail in a slide or two. In addition to being able to save a model, you're actually able to save the output of a particular model run as well. And you're also able to save individual tree parameters. So if you're running a particular model and you've chosen a particular tree and you've modified the parameters so it's behaving the way you'd like, you can actually save that tree separately from the model so that you can keep incorporating it into newer models. And from this, when you go through the inputs, there'll be a little pull down that will allow you to select through any of those libraries of trees that you've developed. When you're actually saving the raw output, it gives you a lot of functionality. I'm showing here kind of a workflow from that. This raw output section is on that tabular part at the bottom of the model. You have the ability to export any of the variables that you've identified as included in your charts will occur here. All of the individual parameters, so if you've chosen 4 or 5 different variations of the parameters, those outputs will all appear here as well. Here you can see in this particular case we actually have 3 versions for the changes in the irrigation fraction. When you export, you have the ability to export that locally or to export it to Google Drive. If you use Google Drive, then those will be available through your normal interface, and if you click on those, then you'll have access to a spreadsheet version of those. And then you can either manipulate those directly within the Google spreadsheet to analyze, or you can download them as an Excel file or however you want to proceed in the processing. In terms of sharing, as I said before, you have the ability to use the share button at any point to modify who's able to access any of your individual models. I should also say this is a view, for those who are familiar with Google Drive, this is sort of the standard generic view of Google Drive. And if you were to double click on this particular model, it's smart enough to understand the format, and it will prompt you to say, hey, do you want to open this in the Poplar growth model? And then it'll launch that directly. At the same time, you can use that collaboration, that share button, to do real-time collaboration with the model. For example, here, if you've shared your model with one other person and you're both looking at it at the same time, up in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see that there's a list of active users that are using it. And any changes that are done by either of those will show up, so you can sort of get together on a phone call or a hangout and discuss these things and see the changes that both are making at the same time. If any of your collaborators are actually modifying a particular input, you can actually see a little notice that shows where in the form they're actually making changes to. Finally, the other feature that we have with data input and output is for weather. It's nice to have average weather values when you want to do sort of predictive studies like we're doing with a lot of our economic models. But if you're trying to do something like a validation, or you want to look at actual changes in terms of very dry or very cold years, you might want to upload actual weather data. And you have the capability to do that in your weather section as well, as opposed to doing it by location. You can upload the data directly, and that can either be a local CSV file or a Google spreadsheet that can be used. And when you load that, you will actually get a list of all of the actual weather data. So instead of a 12-month average, you'll get however many years of data that you're actually putting in. When you save your model, after you've done an upload of weather, the weather data itself gets saved as well, so you don't have to do that again when you come back to the model. This is an example of a study where we were doing some validation of the model or comparisons of the model to some studies that were done in Paris over a 12-year cycle with some different coppicing patterns. So as you load this model up, you have that actual weather data. You can see there are some variations in the graph of how those, the year-to-year variations to that, which have some effect on the predicted yields from the model. This final picture shows a comparison that actually shows this comparison that we were doing for various poplar species for that test in Paris. Here we were trying to develop a single generic poplar, sort of a representative poplar set of parameters. So we were trying not to vary too many of the parameters. The dots in this show the individual field trial stem biomass. The lines are the predictions from the model. The colors match, and for this we were using our generic inputs. We were making one modification, which were some published allometric differences in the allometry, how the biomass was partitioned between the roots and the stems and the leaves for these individual types of poplar. In the future, we have a few ideas of how we want to do some input changes. We want to have a better user interface as we go through these field trials, and some additional information that we're getting from some of our partners through our AHB project. We want to develop a global spatial library, so not only do the individuals have access to those, but you'll have a small set of species that you can pick and choose from. We want to actually make it so that you can use entire trees as part of your parameter changes, so that if you want to see a graph between how two species might appear in the same weather area, you can do that. We've done our best to simplify the variables, but we still know it's a handful, so we're working on trying to organize those in a better manner. Part of that includes including more online documentation within the model. And the only substantive, or one of the planned substantive changes to the model itself, is that the allometric relationships that divide the growth into the stem and root and foliar biomasses in the original model are based primarily on DBH measurements, which are good for stands that live over a long time and are allowed to mature pretty long. But for relatively quick coppicing event, it's not the best parameter to develop those with, and we've found that we get good agreement by using a volume index, which is basically the basal diameter times the length of the major stems to create those allometric relationships. And we'll be adding that into the model as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Nathan, who's going to talk a little bit about how we use these yield predictions in our sustainability studies.
Thanks, Quinn. I'm going to give a quick demonstration here. This is a little preview for a webinar we'll be doing in September, where we're going to go in more detail on these models on the economics of the poplar biofuels production. So as Prasad showed earlier, the 3PG growth model is part of an integrated set of models that we're using to analyze the economics, potential, and sustainability of poplar biofuels. The yield growth speeds both an agricultural economic model of poplar crop adoption, and then that feeds those both feed into a siting model for where is it best to locate biorefineries. Click the button. So here's an example. The first thing you need to do, we have these poplar yields spread across the entire region, and that's not an appropriate look at where you might grow poplar. So we've limited our set of lands based on suitable lands that could be used. And this picture we're showing here are suitable rangelands. So this lands that are currently in grassland areas that are suitable for poplar growth. And we're looking at the non-irrigated yields on those. We also look at the irrigated yields on irrigated cropland to compete that with conventional agriculture. Here's the model that competes conventional agriculture. We put these 3PG yield predictions together with a poplar budget to determine the profitability of poplar and compare that with the profitability of the incumbent crops. And this model is able to find the price point at which poplar becomes competitive in a region. This map here shows for the different regions, we have these regions that are based on the crop management zones by the MAS or NRCS, and they give at a given price how much poplar would be produced, how much poplar is predicted to be produced in our current set of assumptions in each region. Once we have that information, we can put that with models of the biorefineries and how much it costs, and the logistics of the logistics models for delivering feedstocks and fuels to find optimal locations for biorefineries under the current set of knowledge about poplar yields. And this is an example here of a scenario we did looking for four locations in the Pacific Northwest for large biorefineries. And you see the dots. Let me get the arrow. I just click on the arrow, shows up. Aha. We have a red dot there, a blue dot there, a yellow dot hiding in there, and a pink dot over here. Those are our four locations, and they each have feedstock sheds. So showing where the feedstock is being pulled in from for each of these different biorefineries. So once we have these locations, we can do additional analysis. This gives us the price points that you have to pay for the fuel and locations that make sense in order to have poplar biofuels come into the market. And once we have this information, we can look at the system that's predicted and get an understanding of the economic impact on the region and the sustainability through a life cycle assessment. So that's just a quick preview, demonstration of how we're using the yields in our larger integrated model of poplar biofuel production in the Pacific Northwest. But for this presentation, we're focusing on the poplar growth model. The yield is a very important part of determining where the industry can be profitable, and this model provides a great way of exploring this yield without having to put test plots everywhere. So with that, we'd like to welcome questions, and I see that there are quite a few questions in the chat bar, and we need to turn this over to Patricia she has some comments to make.
So thank you, Nathan, Quinn, and Prasad. I just wanted to let everyone know that there will be another webinar on May 7th, Wednesday. This one will be at 4 p.m. because this is largely for educators, specifically middle school, high school teachers. It will feature our team from Oregon State University, including Kate Field and Jay Well, and possibly some graduate students at Oregon State University. And they will be speaking on a framework, a comprehensive framework for bioenergy education. I would like to thank USDA, who funds the Advanced Hardwood Biofuels Northwest project and make this webinar series possible. As I mentioned before, these webinars are archived on our website. And I will turn this back over to University of California, Davis so that they can answer your questions. So please keep typing them into the chat box. I understand some of you may need to go at 11 o'clock, but I'm sure that as long as we have questions coming in, that Nathan, Quinn, and Prasad will be able to answer them. So thank you.
Oh, what happened? Hello? Okay, I hope everyone can still hear us. What we'll be doing is we'll be answering them, I guess, from the, it looks like the questions are actually coming from the bottom up, so I'll be moving in that direction. The first question is, have you been able to verify your model using the demonstration plot harvests that have been done through the AHB process so far? So for those of you that aren't aware, Greenwood Resources is managing a number of demonstration plots for the AHB program. There are 4 of them throughout the Pacific Northwest. For 2 or 3 of those sites, we've had the first coppicing event that took place in last fall. They're collecting a large number of data sets regarding those, not only the total amounts of biomass, but also lots of information that they're using to do the economic analysis in terms of how much yield is harvested per hour by the harvesters so that we can develop costs for those. So those data have been collected and have been preliminarily reviewed. We haven't had access to that data yet, so we're still looking forward to getting that sometime in the near future. We're expecting to get that first set of coppicing in May, I believe. For those areas that have had their coppicing, we're having some additional parameters to try to get us to identify some of these first regrowth things so that we can test some of our individual coppicing at that level as well. The next question is asked. I think they're bottom up. Anyways, the next question is, how do you find a 30-day steps accurate enough? Are the 30-day steps accurate enough for the model? They found that there's large discrepancies when you compare the monthly outputs to the daily outputs. When we do our models, the predictive models using the average weather, we're probably going to stick with monthly data time steps for that because we don't have a real good availability to try to perturb those predictions on a daily time step. When we go back and review these field tests, we actually have the ability to run this model at different increments and to see if we can see changes between those. I have to say that for that study that we were comparing to the Paris model, we have not done that yet, but there's nothing in the model that precludes that. Although having said that, it's possible that the online application is currently tied to a monthly time step. I'll have to check on that particular question. The next question is, would it be possible for this model to work in other parts of the US? It absolutely is possible to do that. The only part that we haven't done is to do the additional tool that allows the averages to be added in. And it was certainly, they're certainly available 40-year averages for the whole US. We use Oregon State's PRISM data in order to create those averages. For most of those inputs for the solar, we use some data from NREL. Those data sets are both available through the whole US. The next question is, why does leaf biomass decline only slightly but not go to zero on annual cycles between coppicing events? That's a good question. We've done a review of a number of different input parameters that go into the model, the 3PG model, and have tried to use those reviews to come up with what, as I said before, our generic model for the poplar. The primary source that we use for that, there's 3 or 4 different good studies on that. The one that we use most of for our inputs are from a study done in Minnesota earlier in the 2000s, 2008 or so. The amount of leaf that's lost is part of the input tree parameters and in the litter fall rate. And you can adjust that litter fall rate so that you get a much greater litter fall as the leaves go into every winter cycle. Those aren't the parameters that we've identified as our default function, but that's certainly something that can be looked at by modifying the parameters of that tree. It turns out when we've done that, you don't have a huge change in the amount of stem growth predictions, but it obviously does affect it because you're having to grow those leaves back more every year. And then finally, how big was the initial poplar database that you used to work out the initial steps? I.e., how many trees to establish the base data set? Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what this exactly the part in terms of the total number of trees. But as I said before, we're using some literature published results to do the input parameters for most of our the tree parameters for the poplar. A lot of that comes from laboratory work as opposed to individual field trials. And then when we do our comparisons of the field trials, we actually try to base our estimates on what the published plantation states were for those individual trials. And predominantly for those, they usually have the poplars planted fairly densely at about between 1 per meter or 1 per 9 meters, I guess was the largest spacing on the ones that we've seen. Typically those plantations are started with poplar sticks. We've also modeled one where seedlings have been used that have been grown in the greenhouse for a year beforehand. Can you read it?
Do your projections?
Oh, the total biomass, yes, includes both the leaf and the stem combined. But not for the total biomass that goes into the economic models. We're using only the stem biomass.
Comment on whether it's possible to save anything other than Google Drive.
Yes, the question asked locally here is if you want to save not to Google Drive, do you have the ability to do that? The answer is yes and no. If you want to save the results, you have the ability to save any of the CSV files locally, but you cannot save the model locally. There's really no reason. The model is actually represented as a great big JavaScript file or JSON file for those that are interested. But in order to associate it back with the application, it's just a lot easier to do that within the Google Drive. Yeah, I'm trying to. Barry, I'm going to have to take your question offline and respond to that. I still think I need a little bit more detail from on your question for that. Okay. Yep. All right. Well, thank you very much. All right. Excellent. Thank you very much for attending. We appreciate you listening to us.